Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. This is Gabe Hamilton from Holland and Hart, and today we're going to be talking about direct primary care practice in Idaho. We'll get the slides are not yet up on the website, but we'll get those up after the talk. So direct primary care is something that's been getting a lot of interest in the market. I was at the National Association of Insurance Commissioners meeting in San Francisco 2 weeks ago, and was able to attend a session that included a pretty lengthy presentation by the Direct Primary Care Coalition to state insurance commissioners on direct primary care, the benefits of direct primary care for patients and physicians, and how it can be better integrated in with health insurance and state insurance law. So we'll talk about those issues today. We'll start with the more basics of what is direct primary care. Start with kind of the most broad definition, which is what the Direct Primary Care Coalition puts out, which is a membership-based alternative payment model in which patients, employers, or health plans pay primary care providers in flat, simple, periodic fees directly for unlimited access to primary care and prevention services in a medical home environment. It's a very broad definition. It's aspirational. It really doesn't reflect the current market or the current legal environment for direct primary care in most states. But that's, I think, a statement of where practitioners would like to see the market go. More functionally, there's an issue paper on this topic that Harvard has put out, and it really defines, it recognizes a little more the differences in direct primary care practice and the variations in model from practice to practice and from state to state. And so what Harvard says is really the identifying attributes of direct primary care are a periodic fee, the lack of billing third parties on a fee-for-service basis, and the last point, which is that anything that's charged on a per-visit basis is going to be less than the amount of the monthly fee. So again, another good general definition, but since we're talking today about Idaho law primarily, the first thing to think about is that that direct primary care is, in essence, a prepaid service contract. Consumer, in this case a patient, enters into a contract with a provider of services and prepays for access to those services. The provider assumes the risk of being able to provide those services on a profitable basis. At some point in the 70s and 80s, state insurance law caught up on the medical side with this and started subjecting the arrangements like this to oversight as managed care. Without a special exemption, direct primary care in almost every state would constitute the transaction of insurance and require an insurance license. With that table set, let's look at what states have done. And most states, as I mentioned, have enacted legislation that specifically exempts direct primary care from insurance law. But each state's a little different in the way they do it. Idaho looks at a contractual relationship between a primary care provider and a patient, in which the provider contracts to provide a defined set of primary care services to the patient for a set fee. So here's the actual definition in Idaho law of direct primary care agreement, and I've highlighted the key elements in the slide. The key elements are you have a primary care provider, an individual patient, and we'll talk a little more about that, but in Idaho, there is no group primary care per se. A direct primary care provider cannot enter into a group contract where it agrees with an employer, for example, to cover all of the employees who work for the employer. That doesn't fit within the definition in Idaho. And then there are direct primary care services, which means that the services have to be provided directly by the contracting provider, not by someone else. And there is a fee paid directly to the provider by the individual, by or on behalf of the patient. So to take apart each piece of that definition a little further, one of the key requirements was a primary care provider. And so as I summarized in the slide and I've given the actual statute, it's pretty broad. A person authorized to provide healthcare services in Idaho in pediatrics, family medicine, internal medicine, or dentistry. The individual providers can group together in professional associations so that you can have a direct primary care practice, one or more providers, and those providers can provide the services. It doesn't need to be just one provider standing alone. And then the other key element here was direct primary care services. So again, this is defined in a very open-ended manner. Any services that the primary care provider is legally authorized to provide. There's a list, but that list is what we call a non-exhaustive list, or a list of examples, it's expressly not a list that limits what services can be provided, but the examples give are screening, assessment, diagnosis, treatment for purpose of promoting health, detection, management, and care of disease or injury, or routine, preventative, or diagnostic dental treatment. And it also says they can be provided in different settings: home, the patient's home, the provider's office, or other locations. And then finally, the fee. So the fee in Idaho law, the fee is a single fee that the provider receives for providing the services set forth in the agreement as the direct primary care services. It covers an agreed upon time interval. Often it's monthly. Sometimes providers will have a larger initial fee to cover a longer period so that patients are enrolled for a minimum number of months before they can terminate. And another point, it's the second bullet point on the slide, is that direct primary care provider can have a menu of additional services for which a per visit fee applies. And you've got to read the law pretty carefully on this one, but if the services are not included as covered within the contract, then they're not direct primary care services. And they're not covered by the statute because they're not a prepaid service. They're a point of service payment. There's no insurance regulatory or other state regulatory issues involved with having a point of service price list. So it's we've covered what is direct primary care from a big picture, broadest point of view of the Direct Primary Care Coalition down through the narrowest, what is actually direct primary care defined as in Idaho law. But I thought it might be helpful to take a step back and think about why direct primary care. And the first bullet is my best effort to summarize it. The advocates for direct primary care, which includes most of the physicians, probably all the physicians who practice direct primary care, and I think a fair number of the patients, are that they see it as more than just an alternative payment model. They really see it as a paradigm shift in healthcare. And when you hear the providers talk about it, they talk about the time they have to provide individualized care at really a lower cost than a traditional setting. and they talk about the joy of being able to focus on treatment, not reimbursement, and not coding. The Direct Primary Care Coalition, which is sort of the leading national group promoting direct primary care and advocating on its behalf. Like I said, they were at the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. It was clear that that was not their first time at that meeting. They do travel around the country talking about this issue with federal and state legislators. They have a statement of 5 principles. They say that the defining element of direct primary care is an enduring and trusting relationship between the patient. And then they break out 5 principles that create that relationship. They say it's service, patient choice, elimination of fee-for-service, advocacy, and stewardship. And so just to take a little closer look at what they're talking about. For service, this is where they're talking about the additional time that the provider and patients have to talk through issues, to assess lifestyle choices and treatment decisions aimed at long-term health and well-being. And they talk about elements that promote that, which are frequently found in direct primary care practices: extended hours, ready access to urgent care, and small patient panel sizes. The second element is patient choice. And this is really, according to the advocates of this model, this is the key to understanding the model. And one of the questions that I heard when I was at the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, directed at the president of the Direct Primary Care Coalition, was, well, how do we regulate this? What do we do if patients are getting bad service or not, that providers aren't delivering on the extended hours, the additional time, and are just churning patients in the traditional manner? Well, I suppose I shouldn't say that the traditional manner involves churning patients, but they are abusing this relationship to churn patients and collect additional fees for services not rendered. And the response was, well, patients have a choice. We're regulated by the free market. We enroll people on a monthly basis. Like I said, it's not uncommon for the initial enrollment period to be a little longer, so that the patient has an opportunity to settle in and start to experience the treatment before just signing up for a month, getting some care, and then dropping back off. But anyway, the fundamental argument is, if the patients don't like what they're getting, they can cancel their subscription. They can enroll with a different direct primary care provider. They could abandon direct primary care and return to the traditional fee-for-service setting. In other words, this is a market-regulated, self-regulating approach to care in which the consumer or the patient makes the decisions about his or her own care and his or her own choice of provider. And then the third bullet point, the elimination of fee-for-service. This is a talking point of the coalition that relates to the potentials for distorted incentives in the fee-for-service market. This has obviously been a major topic in recent years with multiple approaches to moving away from fee-for-service, and the Direct Primary Care Coalition likes to position direct primary care as part of the solution to the problem of the incentives created by fee-for-service. And then they see advocacy as part of this, where the primary care physicians become advocates for their patients, helping them take the time to make informed decisions and referrals. And stewardship. And by stewardship, I think they mean stewardship of their patients' long-term health care, and that's defined in this bullet point, which is up on the slide. And then continuing on the topic of why direct primary care, I think it's also important to discuss the research that's been done on the sustainability of the practice, whether it's a good business practice and whether it makes sense for the patient and for the physicians who practice this way. And the research that's been done suggests that it is. There's an acknowledgement up front that the fee paid under a direct primary care service is probably a greater percentage of the healthcare dollar going to primary care than would be paid to the primary care under the normal fee-for-service or fee-for-service model. But the argument is that by eliminating the relationship with third-party payers and the need for administrative overhead, they can actually deliver services for 80% less cost, and so there's a net savings to the consumer who will be receiving more of his or her care through the primary care practice than would be receiving otherwise, and potentially decreasing downstream healthcare costs. And the MGMA has done a study as well, and what they found was that at a $60 per patient per month, direct primary care practitioner would need a panel of 867 patients to earn the same revenue. Not the same. That's not the same net revenue, but the same gross revenue as a fee-for-service practice with a panel size of 2,251 patients. The advocates of direct primary care, when they're talking about the economics, would point out that the direct primary care practice with lower overhead may actually have a higher net revenue on the same growth that wasn't included in the MGMA study. And then just a final point to note is that according to the Direct Primary Care Coalition, there are 903 DPC practices nationwide, and the median fee is $70 per month, so that the $60 per month used by the MGMA is a reasonable number in calculating that, the economics there. So with that behind us, the general discussion of what is direct primary care, why direct primary care, and we're going to turn to what are the requirements for a DPC practice in Idaho. As I discussed in sort of the first few slides, the key element of direct primary care practice in Idaho is an agreement. It's a contractual relationship established between the patient and the provider. And Idaho law has a number of requirements that apply to this agreement. And I've bulleted them out here. Some are more obvious than others. The agreement has to identify the patient and the provider. The agreement has to specify the scope of services and actually name specific services covered. And these would be the direct primary care services. Any additional a la carte services offered in the office would not be part of this agreement. Locations for services. In other words, if the physician will come to your home, that should be stipulated in the contract. The amount of the fee and when it needs to be paid, again, fairly straightforward. The duration of the agreement, and this is where it gets a little interesting. The agreement must list the conditions upon which the provider can terminate. In other words, the provider does not have the right to terminate the agreement at will, but has to list in its agreement specific conditions to give rise to the provider's right to terminate. But the patient, on the other hand, has to have the right to terminate at will. And finally, the agreement can't be assignable by the provider. It can't be sold or transferred without the patient's consent. The idea here being if a patient chooses a doctor, the doctor cannot turn around and pass that contract on to a different provider that's seen as a personal relationship and would need the consent of the patient. Then some other details of Idaho law on this topic. We talked about how the agreement has to be terminable at will of the patient. Well, if the patient terminates, the practice needs to return any unearned fees. Not exactly clear from the statute what that means. If that would mean partial months, I think their provider might have a good argument that partial month fees are not refundable. That once you paid for a month, you have access for the rest of the month. You can terminate at the end of the next month, but it's not perfectly clear under the law. Let's say that there was a 60-day or 90-day prepayment, then certainly the prepaid fees beyond that first month need to be returned. Neither the patient or the provider can bill insurance for services provided under the direct primary care agreement. So there can't be, if you've paid a fee, prepaid a fee for services, or you've received a fee to deliver services on a prepaid basis, even if the patient is covered by insurance and those services are covered services, they cannot be submitted for reimbursement by the insurer. And there's a disclaimer. And the disclaimer goes to the fact that the direct primary care contract is not a contract of insurance, does not provide all of the essential health benefits and minimum essential coverage required by federal law, and recommending that in addition to direct primary care, patients seek a traditional health insurance policy. And I talked about this earlier and mentioned again. The other thing is that the contract has to be with individuals. Now, that doesn't mean an individual can be a family, patient and dependents, but it cannot be a group, such as an employer group. With that, we'll move on to the topic of direct primary care and insurance. This is an area with a certain amount of friction. It's important to understand the traps that are possible here. As a starting point, most providers who offer a direct primary care practice simply opt out. They do not participate in Medicare, Medicaid, or any commercial insurance. They're just out of network, and they run their practices completely independently of third-party payments. But if you want to stay in an in-network basis with one or more of these payers, you really have to be careful. The typical agreement will prohibit the provider from collecting payment for covered services beyond the cost share provided in the contract. So if there's a copay or a deductible or a co-insurance, the provider can collect that, but the provider cannot collect the direct primary care fee for services that are covered by the contract. So if you're in the network, you have people who are covered by that network, it's really a direct breach of the provider contract to accept direct primary care payments from those patients. When you're talking about Medicare, Medicaid, it goes beyond contractual breach. It's a violation of federal law. As I've noted here, it's also a violation of state law in Idaho, and the payers take it very seriously as a breach of their agreements. In contrast, a self-funded employer group that is not receiving their benefits through an insurer but have a self-funded employer group have a little more flexibility. They can provide an arrangement in which the plan will reimburse payments made by basically have a direct primary care allowance that patients can use to purchase memberships at a direct primary care practice. Remember, the contract has to be with the patient, not with the group. It's important to distinguish that kind of relationship from an on-site care clinic where the employer-sponsored on-site clinic provides free or reduced cost care to employees That's again a different but similar arrangement to a direct primary care benefit. And there's some considerations. It's not as simple as that. The employer sponsored program needs to consider compliance with employee benefit law, federal employee benefit laws, including the limitations on health reimbursement arrangements and high deductible health plans. And to touch on that issue a little more depth, high deductible health plans are typically paired with health savings accounts and also cannot be supported by employers until the deductible amount is met. So that calls into question the employer's ability to provide a direct primary care allowance to anybody who's on a high deductible health plan. It also means that the person on the high deductible health plan cannot use their HSA account, any saving money they put in there, to pay for their direct primary care out of their own pocket, so to speak, or at least out of the HSA pocket. The final point here on direct primary care insurance is just to note that there's been an attempt to incorporate direct primary care into qualified health plans, which are the plans sold to individuals and small groups under the Affordable Care Act. And I've quoted here the language from the Affordable Care Act, Section 1301A3, one of the subsequent amendments that wasn't in the original law. But it doesn't really go far enough to make this a viable in the market. The idea is that there would be wraparound insurance with a direct primary care component providing the core primary care services and insurance wrapping around. But the way that one section of the ACA is drafted, it doesn't get you there. It doesn't address key issues necessary to integrate direct primary care and an ACA health plan, and listed some of those issues there. The effect on actuarial value of the plans and the metal tiers, the coordination of patient cost sharing, such as deductible or copay limits with the payments made to the direct primary care practice, and also the issue of patient choice, which is often seen as fundamental to direct primary care, meaning that the patient chooses the physician and is not the choice of physician. It's not dictated by the insurance plan. With that, I'm going to turn to the very last couple of slides of my presentation, so it looks like we're going to get done a bit early today, and talk about some of the new developments. One thing that that people are tracking is that the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services have started to gather information on direct primary care. It looks like there's an interest in perhaps folding it into Medicare and Medicaid, making Medicare and Medicaid more friendly to direct primary care, part of a medical home model. There's no details on where that's going, but many are excited, I think, that it's at least being considered as a model. There's movement, not final yet, to correct the IRS rules that say a direct primary care payment cannot be made from an HSA for people with high deductible health plans. And then I think there's started to be some discussions around state innovation waivers under the Affordable Care Act, which would allow states to really potentially build on the promise of ACA Section 1301A and get it to the point where it would actually be workable, where there would be waivers given from some of the requirements of the ACA for insurance products, so that they could truly be compatible with the direct primary care and wraparound approach. That is the last of my slides. Since I'm finishing a little early, I would be willing to take some Q&A. If anyone has any questions, give it a minute for that. Otherwise, we'll also have, I noticed here I neglected to put out my contact details. So we'll be presenting this our website, the slides and the version that goes on the website will have my contact information. My name is Gabriel Hamilton. I'm an attorney at Holland and Hart, and email and phone will be available on the version of this that makes it on the website. Well, it doesn't look like I'm getting any questions here coming up through the Q&A module with WebEx. So with that, I'm gonna wrap this up. Thank you all for attending. I hope you found this informative. And although I did neglect to put in my contact information, please do feel free to reach out with any questions as follow-up. Thank you again. Bye-bye.